In 1861, the United States stepped into an abyss. As southern states seceded en masse, the nation slid inexorably towards disaster. The result? A conflict that devastated the country, killing up to 750,000 people. Today, the Civil War is a cornerstone of the American story, a tale every school kid learns. But what about the prelude? What about the war before the war known as Bleeding Kansas? Erupting in 1855, Bleeding Kansas saw free soilers, abolitionists, and pro-slavery advocates all flood Kansas territory, determined to influence its upcoming constitution. Heavily armed, they quickly turned to violence, locking the region into a cycle of revenge killings, arson, and massacres. Yet the effects of this anarchy weren't just limited to Kansas. Intimately connected to the wider politics of the day, Bleeding Kansas helped radicalize a nation, pushing it to the brink of war. By the time the fighting ended, America itself would be mere weeks away from acting out the same violence on a much grander scale. Both a portrait of a nation on the edge and a tale of how violence begets more violence, this is Bleeding Kansas, the Civil War that helped spark the Civil War. It was 1854 when Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas made the decision that wouldn't just torpedo his career, but nearly drown the nation alongside it. One of the big political beasts of his day, Douglas was a Northern Democratic firebrand, almost as skilled at politics as he was bizarre looking. Standing at a mere 5'4" with an oversized head that didn't fit his body, Douglas was known as the Little Giant. Yet he was also a talented senator, tipped as a likely future president, someone who believed it was his mission to secure the American West. In 1854, that meant finally organizing the territories beyond the Missouri River. As part of the Louisiana Purchase, the region had come into America's possession way back in 1803, but the push to organize it into official territories had died out in 1820 when the Missouri Compromise outlawed the creation of new slave states above the 3630 parallel. That meant that new territories would have to be free, which in turn meant admitting them to the Union would upset the balance of power between free and slave states. So every time someone tried to open up these territories to settlement, the Southerners would be all like, what? And give the staters a bunch of extra senators. Sure. We'll also massage their balls while we're at it. Yeah? Okay? No. The result was deadlock. Without Southern votes, the territories were doomed to languish, stuck outside the US proper. But Stephen Douglas wasn't a political heavyweight for nothing. He knew that he could crack this. All that was needed was a clever compromise. The linchpin of that compromise: popular sovereignty. Under the Little Giant's proposals, the region would be split into two territories, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. That done, each would vote on whether to be a slave or a free state. The federal government would accept the will of the people, and everything would be all sunshine and rainbows. The only flaw was that a pro-slavery vote in either would effectively kill the Missouri Compromise. But Douglas was confident no one could argue with the cause of letting the people themselves decide. After all, popular sovereignty had been applied to Utah and New Mexico after they were admitted following the Mexican-American War, and nobody had crapped their pants over that. But the Little Giant would quickly discover that what had worked before wouldn't work now. Rather than defuse the issue, he'd just shoved his tiny foot deep into a nest of angry, politicized hornets. The passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act with Southern help set off the mother of all backlashes. Senator Charles Sumner called it an atrocious plot to expand slavery. That same year, the Republican Party was founded in direct opposition. But while there would be repercussions at the national level, it was on the ground that Douglas's first plan showed signs of violently unraveling. Since Nebraska was so far north, no one believed it would be anything but free. But newly created Kansas, that was another matter. Bordering slave state Missouri, it could vote either way, and that chilled abolitionists' hearts almost as much as it excited pro-slavery advocates. Because if Kansas could become a slave state, that meant the Missouri Compromise was dead. That meant slavery could potentially be expanded across the nation. The balance of power in the US then would be decided in this new territory, and the losers might well be consigned to oblivion. Both sides could only see one option. They would have to make sure Kansas voted the way they wanted it to. With the election of the Kansas Territorial Legislature set for March 1855, a starting pistol had been fired. In abolitionist New England and slave-owning Missouri alike, desperate plans were made to ensure the outcome they wanted. For Missourians, the idea of being near surrounded by free states was seen as an existential threat, the first stage in abolitionist plot to undermine the state. Equally, abolitionists felt Kansas becoming a slave state would open the door to this evil institution being imposed on everyone. You know how today's political parties descend on swing states during the elections? Well, it was that, but times a billion. And that meant the tricks were a billion times dirtier too. In Massachusetts, businessmen founded the New England Emigrant Aid Company, or NEAC, to help northern abolitionists resettle in Kansas so they could influence the vote. These northerners founded free state strongholds like Topeka and Osawatomie, and most radically abolitionist of all, the town of Lawrence. Overall, about 2,000 NEAC types would settle in Kansas ahead of the vote, a mix of hardcore abolitionists and free soilers who were fine with Deep South slavery but opposed to its spread. In the context of a territory with a voting population of only around 3,000, that influx was pretty damn significant. Unfortunately, they were more than matched by shenanigans on the pro-slavery side. Although plenty of slavery advocates had likewise moved to Kansas Territory, those in Missouri decided not to leave things to chance. As March approached, Senator David Rice Atchison whipped up fears of an abolitionist plot to surround their state. Come the vote, Atchison personally led a force of Missourians across the border to deliver a pro-slavery result. Known as Border Ruffians, the intruders intimidated free staters, threatened to shoot election officials, and engaged in fraud on an eye-watering scale. The town of Leavenworth, for example, was recorded as casting 5 times as many votes as it had citizens. One pro-slavery candidate, remember, out of a total voting population of under 3,000, claimed a 5,000 vote victory over his free state rival. As Senator Atchison roared to his supporters, "There are 1,100 coming over from Platte County to vote, and if that ain't enough, we can send 5,000, enough to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the territory." But while the Border Ruffians' tactics were a win on paper, in reality, they just shot themselves in the foot. Even the most nakedly partisan observer had to admit that the election had been marred by fraud. Governor Andrew Reeder even re-ran the contest in parts of the state, returning new free soil candidates. But when the legislature finally sat, it became clear the political games weren't over. The pro-slavery majority immediately voted to overturn the rerun votes, handing seats back to the fraudulently elected slave staters. In response, the remaining free soldiers walked out. That September, they joined forces with the territory's abolitionists and regular folk, outraged at the ballot stuffing, and set up their own legislature at Topeka. As fall gave way to winter, Kansas Territory found itself in possession of 2 governments, one free and one slave, with most citizens prepared to only obey one of them. With tensions rising, preparations began for the coming violence. In the free towns, crates marked books or Bibles began arriving, courtesy of NEAC. Inside were rifles and ammunition. When things kicked off, the free staters would be ready. At least, that was the plan. In truth, though, no one would be prepared for the violence that followed. Now, before we get to the killing, we should probably note who actually made up the population of Kansas Territory. Because while Bleeding Kansas would be about slavery, very few people living there were actually slaveholders. Nearly the entire pro-slavery population were just poor migrants who'd never owned slaves, never would, and supported their side simply because they were from the South. Likewise, most free staters tended to be subsistence farmers, many of whom were anti-slavery only because they hated the idea of having to share Kansas with black people. Only a fraction of settlers, in other words, had any dog in this fight. Most simply wanted to be left alone to raise their families. And just remember that, as everything starts to unravel, that almost everyone dying isn't some evil slaver or abolitionist extremist, but an ordinary person forced by circumstances to just pick a side. It was this same partisan filtering that would soon turn a regular death into political napalm. On November the 21st, 1855, Free Stater Charles Dow was murdered by pro-slavery Franklin Coleman. Now, this wasn't a political killing. Coleman and Dow had been in a property dispute, and Coleman simply decided to settle said dispute with bullets. But that's not how anyone else in this highly volatile territory saw it. When pro-slavery Sheriff Samuel J. Jones investigated, it was like, wait, this dead dude's a Free Stater? Crack the Bud Light, boys, we're gonna have a party. Rather than arrest Coleman, he arrested Dow's Free Stater friend, Jacob Branson, a vindictive political act, and one that would inspire immediate backlash. That night, a Free Stater posse sprang Branson from custody, spiriting him away to Lawrence, now heart of the anti-slavery forces. Sheriff Jones demanded the governor call out the Territorial militia, but he didn't exactly want non-partisan backup. The 2,000-strong militia that mustered were nearly all Missourians, and they were all pro-slavery. Rather than take Branson back into custody, they wanted to march on Lawrence and smash the abolitionists, which Sheriff Jones was happy to oblige. On December the 1st, the town was surrounded. Inside, Free Staters armed themselves for what they assumed would be the final showdown. In the end, though, it was just the warm-up act. After 6 days of siege, the militia shot and killed a civilian who tried to leave Lawrence for his farm. Rather than escalate things, the bloodshed seems to have made everyone hesitate, to look sideways at one another and wonder uneasily, we really want to do this, guys? When a brutal cold snap then hit, it was enough to end the siege. The wavering militia members decamped and scattered to their homes. Known as the Wakarusa War, this dark incident could have been the end of it, the moment Kansas tipped back from the cliff edge. Had it not been for Sheriff Goddamn Jones. Clearly someone who loved to bear a grudge, Jones never forgot the disrespect that Lawrence had shown him. So the following spring, he returned to the city to arrest those who'd helped spring Branson from his clutches. There, on April the 23rd, 1856, someone shot him in the back. While Jones survived his wounds, the Free State Legislature nearly didn't. A few weeks later, the Territorial government ordered several of its members arrested in Lawrence. But this wasn't enough for the sheriff. With both his ego and his body now wounded, Jones decided to settle matters with the Free Staters once and for all. Raising 750 men, he marched on Lawrence. On May the 21st, roads were blocked and cannons were aimed against the town. Then the mob attacked and Bleeding Kansas officially began. The sack of Lawrence was simultaneously shocking and surprisingly restrained. On the shocking side, the offices of the town's 2 anti-slavery newspapers were trashed, the homes of abolitionists ransacked and burned, and the Free State Hotel was bombarded with cannon fire. On the other side of this ledger, though, the mob didn't kill a single person. The only death recorded was when a pro-slavery rioter was hit by a chunk of falling masonry. Yet it wasn't the comparative restraint that Free Staters saw in the town's destruction. It was fire and smoke, blood and tears, a growing sense of threat that could only be answered in kind. The destruction of Lawrence may have restored Sheriff Jones's honor, but it had also set Kansas Territory on the path to war. At almost the exact same time Lawrence was going up in flames, the Kansas bloodshed was spreading to Congress. On the 19th of May, Senator Charles Sumner had given a speech attacking pro-slavery forces in the territory, a speech that included some extremely unflattering remarks about a fellow senator. Unfortunately for Sumner, that senator had a relative in the House of Representatives, Preston Brooks, who felt Southern honor obliged him to repay the insult. The day after the sack of Lawrence, Brooks entered the Senate, found Sumner, and beat him so severely with a cane that he nearly killed him. It was one of the worst acts of violence to ever take place in the Senate, and it would help push the fast-developing Civil War in Kansas to new heights, particularly when the Free State press portrayed it as part of a slave power conspiracy to murder abolitionists. For John Brown, such a sentence was less a warning and more an invitation. A free state and newly settled in Kansas Territory, John Brown was also perhaps the most hardcore abolitionist in the whole of America. Like if abolition was a celebrity, Brown would have been standing for it so hard that even Eminem's original Stan would be all like, whoa, dude, obsessed much? And just like Stan, Brown would happily turn to murder in the name of his idol. The news of Lawrence's burning reached Brown on the 22nd of May as he led a small party of Free Staters to help protect the city. Appalled, Brown quickly changed direction, heading now for Pottawatomie Creek. There, starting at 10 p.m. on the 24th of May, Brown, his sons, and followers exacted their bloody revenge. Slave stater James Doyle was taken from his cabin and shot, and 2 of his sons were hacked to pieces with broadswords. A member of the pro-slavery legislature, Alan Wilkinson, was dragged from his wife's sickbed and stabbed to death. Finally, a man named Sherman was hauled out another cabin and murdered, his body dumped in the creek behind his home. The 5 murders Brown and his associates committed that night became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. They shook the nation. One congressman wrote, "The Kansas fight has just occurred, and times are stirring. Everybody here feels as if we are on a volcano." While the sack of Lawrence had ratcheted up the temperature, it was Pottawatomie that set the pot boiling over. The first to move was the pro-slavery side. Under U.S. Deputy Marshal Robert L. Pate, 50 border ruffians descended on Free Stater homesteads, destroying furniture and intimidating the owners. But news of this just invited more retaliation. On the 2nd of June, John Brown and 30 men attacked Pate and his ruffians outside present-day Baldwin City. Known as the Battle of Black Jack, it saw Pate's men surrounded and forced into surrender. While only 4 were injured in the fighting, the engagement has been called the first battle of the American Civil War, the first organized violence conducted between 2 militias on opposite sides of the slavery debate. More immediately, it also added fuel to the Kansas wildfire. Freaked out by the spreading violence, the Territorial governor fled, leaving his pro-slavery secretary Daniel Woodson in charge. Woodson then used the military to shut down the rival Free State Legislature, sparking yet another backlash. In revenge, radical abolitionist Jim Lane led 100 men on a rampage, attacking and burning 3 log cabins used as meeting points by the pro-slavery faction. By the time they attacked the final cabin, nicknamed Fort Titus, on August the 16th, they'd managed to loot a cannon. As 34 slave staters cowered inside, they blasted away, finally forcing a surrender after 2 had been killed and 5 badly wounded. The Battle of Fort Titus ended with the cabin set ablaze and the slaves working there all set free. On the free side, 9 had been wounded, with 1 later dying of his injuries. But Fort Titus was far from the end of Kansas's bloody summer. It might already be nearly fall, but the worst was still to come. If we're doing our jobs, one thing you should have noticed by now is that the most distinctive feature of Bleeding Kansas was the way violence beget violence. In this way, it was perhaps closer to Albania's 1997 collapse into disorder than a regular civil war, in that it was dictated as much by vendettas as by commanders moving men to some grand plan. That being said, there were some set-piece battles, the biggest of which was the Battle of Osawatomie. Centered on the town of the same name, it saw Missourians Reverend Martin White and John W. Reed lead 250 border ruffians to march on the settlement in the hope of flushing out John Brown. On August the 30th, they launched a surprise assault from the west, immediately capturing and killing Brown's son Frederick. Although Brown and his men fought back, the battle would be a catastrophe. Forced to retreat across the Murder-Zane River, the Free Staters first lost several men and then were forced to watch as Osawatomie was sacked and burned. It was the high point of fighting that summer, the first serious, bloody battle of the period. Luckily, it was also one of the last. Less than 2 weeks later, on September the 9th, 1856, John Geary was installed as the new Kansas governor. His first order was to disband all state militia and bring in the U.S. Army to restore order. This didn't completely end the violence. The Battle of Hickory Point, fought 5 days later, saw Free Staters bombard a small pro-slavery settlement with a looted artillery piece. But it did throw a wet blanket on the fire. As the U.S. Army moved in, many of the most violent men left the territory. John Brown, for example, slipped away to raise money. By the end of the summer, the low-scale war in Kansas had seen around 38 people killed. That might not sound like much, especially compared to the hundreds of thousands that would die in the Civil War, but in context, it was an appalling number. As far as America was concerned, 1856 had been a summer of anarchy. Towns had burned, people had been murdered, actual battles had been fought. Think back to the unrest of summer 2020, unrest that left only 25 dead. Think of how big an impact that had on the entire nation, how America is still dealing with the fallout a year and a half later. In 1856, Bleeding Kansas was that feeling on steroids, a howl of anguish that had nearly broken the country. Sadly, politicians in D.C. would soon conspire to make things even worse. Spring 1857 dawned with a new man in the White House, the Southern-sympathizing Democrat James Buchanan, a guy who was to the presidency what Jared Fogle was to sandwich-based snacks. The moment his term began, Buchanan made it a top priority to get Kansas admitted as a state. Unfortunately, he did so without a single thought to what had caused the territory to explode in the first place. Buchanan removed the nonpartisan governor John Geary, as in the guy who would have calmed the violence, replacing him with someone else. He then allowed the pro-slavery legislature to hold a constitutional convention, despite that legislature only being elected via ballot stuffing. The result was the Lecompton Constitution, a document that can be basically summed up as "Woo! Slavery!" repeated 1 billion times over. When this document was put to public vote, there was only 2 options: accept the pro-slavery Constitution or accept a watered-down version that didn't allow new slaves to be brought in, but kept those already in Kansas enslaved for life. As one local trolley noted, it was like being offered a choice between taking arsenic with bread and butter and taking it straight. Yet Buchanan champions the Lecompton Constitution, pressuring Congress to accept it, perhaps the single most effective thing he could have done to re-raise tensions. And where tensions went in 1850s Kansas, bloodshed inevitably followed. "1858 began with both free and slave staters in Kansas on a knife edge. The year before had seen new elections kick out the old territorial legislature and replace it with one that was majority free staters. But at the same time, the Lecompton Constitution was still being pushed by Buchanan. Perhaps this explains the flare-up of violence that occurred along the Missouri border that winter, a flare-up that saw homes burned and 5 pro-slavery men separately murdered. It was this return to violence that would soon power the last great atrocity of the period, the Marais Massacre. One of the homes burned along the border, you see, belonged to the pro-slavery Charles Hamilton. But rather than leave Kansas territory for good after his life went up in smoke, Hamilton crossed into Missouri, gathered up a group of 25 men, and marched back into Kansas to exact his revenge. On the 19th of May 1858, his posse moved through the Marais River Valley, pulling anyone suspected of anti-slavery sentiments from their homes and taking them prisoner. Once he'd swept through the valley, Hamilton released the very young, the very old, and anyone who, like him, was a Freemason. Then he marched the remaining 11 men to a ravine, lined them all up, and had them shot. This being an era of weaker weapons, only 5 of the men actually died. The other 6 were left to lie in the ditch and play dead, all but one of them badly wounded. In return, this latest bloodletting inspired another attempt at violence. Hearing the massacre had been planned in the town of Fort Scott, Free Staters marched on it, determined to kill those responsible. But by now, federal troops were in Kansas territory in force. The posse were unable to enter Fort Scott. And so a repeat of the bloodshed of summer 1856 was avoided. That doesn't mean the tensions in Kansas died down, though. Over the next year, there would be random assassinations as ordinary settlers were occasionally found dead, murdered for their politics. At the same time, Charles Hamilton continued to harass border communities, sometimes fighting small skirmishes with anti-slavery jayhawkers, sometimes with federal troops. Yet by now, the political fight that originally sparked Bleeding Kansas was nearly over. With Free Staters now in the ascendancy, the Lecompton Constitution was killed for good by popular vote in 1858. The next year, the new Territorial Legislature wrote the anti-slavery Wyandotte Constitution, sending it off to Congress for approval. On the 31st of January 1859, after leading a raid that freed 11 states, John Brown left Kansas Territory for the final time, taking his gang of extremists with him. They'd resurface in Virginia not 10 months later, leading a raid on the Harpers Ferry arsenal, a crime for which Brown would hang. But while it's Harpers Ferry that he's remembered for today, it was in the nasty little civil war in Kansas that John Brown made his name, and where he first got a taste for violence. According to the Kansas Historical Society, the last murders of Bleeding Kansas took place in November of 1860. That same month, Abraham Lincoln became president-elect of a nation torn apart in part because of the mayhem and anarchy emanating from Kansas. In the weeks following Lincoln's victory, southern states began seceding from the Union. While in the medium term, and medium here means only a few months, this would result in the Civil War, in the super short term, it ended the Kansas conflict. With fewer Southern senators now sitting, Congress accepted the Wyandotte Constitution on the 21st of January 1861, voting for Kansas statehood. 8 days later, James Buchanan signed Kansas's admission into law. It joined the Union as a free state, just as the Union teetered on the verge of collapse. The admission of the Sunflower State officially ended Bleeding Kansas after 6 years and 56 deaths. For a civil war, that's arguably a tiny death toll. During the US Civil War, Kansas would lose 8,500 citizens, so many orders of magnitude greater that it's like comparing nuclear Armageddon to a wet fart. But to only focus on those killed is to miss the point. Bleeding Kansas was one of the key events that destabilized the US in this era, paving the way for the Civil War. It was Buchanan's insistence, for example, on approving the Lecompton Constitution that helped split the Democratic Party in 1860, allowing Lincoln to win without a single Southern electoral vote. It was also amid the violence of Bleeding Kansas that Lincoln morphed from an underdog to a serious candidate for his party's nomination after he visited the territory in December 1859. For all its effects on national politics, though, Bleeding Kansas is today perhaps best understood as a preview of what was to come. In the organized battles between mostly northern free staters and mostly southern pro-slavery forces, in the sacking and burning of towns, in the massacres of people on the other side of the political divide, we can see a clear prelude to the fight that would soon consume the nation. If the Civil War was the main performance, then Bleeding Kansas was the dark, depressing overture. For that reason, if for no other, it deserves its place in history. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do utilize that like button below. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel. If you've got a suggestion for a future video, please do leave it in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.